Donkey Kong, a worldwide phenomenon that released in arcade store in the summer of 1981, arguably a game released by Nintendo that pioneered the platformer genre. The game is also famous for featuring a certain plumber's first appearance. This would be Mario, of course, although he wasn't Super at this point. That came later with Super Mario Bros. And of course, we obviously have Donkey Kong here too, which is still around today as a major Nintendo icon. We also have Pauline here to rescue within the game. Forget Princess Peach or Princess Toadstool, this is Pauline. Originally, the game was set up with Popeye in mind, where Bluto would have been Donkey Kong, Olive Oil would have been Pauline, and obviously Popeye would have been Mario. But due to licensing issues, this was never going to be. I am fairly sure 99% of people watching this video will know of Donkey Kong and how it plays. But if you happens to be that 1%, it's a case of climbing a construction site to rescue Pauline. We need to jump over barrels and other objects, which will mean starting the level all over again if we get hit. We can earn points by walking over certain things within the game, as well as walking into hammers to smash barrels, ultimately rescue Pauline then. The original game took just 3 months to make and was originally said that it would be a failure. An odd thing to say really, consider it went on to be one of the highest grossing games of all time, earning around 4.4 billion across every platform it was ever released for. The game itself features music, sound effects, introduction sequence to the stages, and the ability to jump too. So yeah, we obviously have many home conversions of Donkey Kong, as you might know. This game has been on pretty much everything to date, so we are ranking the original era of releases here today, roughly from 1981 up until around 1988. No aftermarket releases will be ranked as usual as per my arcade ports rules. This video is strictly official releases only, as there were a ridiculous amount of clones of this game and so on. I will also note here that there were slightly different versions of this game over time, such as regional differences as well as character name changes too. I will be basing this video on the original 1981 US release only, and the game and watch version will not be here either. So get ready to hear some strange sounds from the early 80s to late 1980s. We are today going to establish which home conversion of Donkey Kong was the best. Atari Soft brought us Donkey Kong for IBM PC compatibles in 1983. Now, of course, we have no introduction sequence here, neither do we have a good layout to replicate the arcade game itself. Donkey Kong is on the right hand side here on level 1, who actually reminds me of a character from Monsters Inc. I can't really say that the colours used are any good here because they're simply not, and considering there was other versions on different platforms that released around this time and even before this one, this was fairly shoddy. Mario did not stop. Once moving left or right, he would continue walking. To stop him from moving, I'd have to jump, and then at that point he would stop. Also, by moving the joystick up or down would bring Mario to a halt. When Mario moves, I was thinking how much he resembled Mr. Bean dancing, swinging those arms around, grabbing the hammer and waiting for it to stop seems like a lifetime in this version. It's got a terrible opening sound to it, and Pauline doesn't have text above her either saying help. It's just not a good version at all. The music that starts the game was terrible and sounded really depressing, and sound effects here was really bad too. We did, however, get an animated Donkey Kong throwing barrels. The Mattel Intellivision received its home conversion in 1982 by Coleco Industries. This is a very blocky version of the game, as you can see, but given this is being played on a 1979 home console, it's to be expected really. Push that to one side. Is the game mechanics good here? Well, yes, they aren't too bad. Mario's jump height is fairly good compared with other versions, and he does respond well to controls. Of course, there isn't any music here, and the extremely rudimentary sound effects. Donkey Kong is animated, as you can see him throwing barrels down at you through the platforms. Of course, the speed of this game is fairly slow in comparison to other versions of this game on different platforms. And it doesn't present us with a love heart once we make it to Pauline. It will give us a quick beep sound of level completion and just move to the next stage. We also don't get an introduction to the game here either. This was the version that I originally played as a fairly young kid. This Atari 2600 Coco 1982 release was also developed by the famous Gary Kitchen, who not only developed Game Maker, but did a hell of a lot around early Activision games. So this is a fairly average Atari 2600 release. We plug the cartridge in and we just see the gameplay screen and move the levers on the console to change difficulty settings as usual. I haven't played this version in years, but it soon came back to me that Donkey Kong here kinda reminds me of a gingerbread man, and the barrels look like cookies being thrown. One thing that I noticed straight away is that Donkey Kong is actually positioned on the correct side here, unlike many other versions doing it the other way round. We get no music whatsoever here, it's just sound effects, which aren't too bad I suppose for a 2600 game. We also get centralised positioning of the game to give it that more arcade authenticity. Pauline has no speech bubble or text buffer. It is a very bare bones version. Come level 2, which I think of as a very difficult level, is a little different here. I can't work out if the enemies in level 2 are actually fires, which are walking around. Then if they are, they still don't climb up or down ladders, which makes this version a little easier than most as an arcade game, and most other versions had them chasing after you up and down ladders. Like I say, a very bare bones version, but a slight upgrade visually compared to the Intellivision's release. By far, the 1986 Ocean release of Donkey Kong for the ZX Spectrum was the most very irritating version. Firstly, I understand the ZX Spectrum couldn't help color clash much, but when fires are climbing up the platforms, it normally sticks out a mile because of the colors. Here, as they climb up the ladders, they merge into the white, and they can be almost invisible to see until it's too late. Something else here is that the ladders are just so long and it seems to take longer than other versions to climb up to those platforms. Problem is that Mario takes his time climbing too. When we have a version of Donkey Kong with more barrels being thrown than usual, being slow isn't a good thing. I didn't make it to level 2 here. After around 30 minutes of trying, this version, although looks nice with its Spectrum colours, really didn't do it for me at all for a few reasons here. Did you ever notice with this version that Pauline actually looks more like a matchstick man here? A real shame, as this also came with a fairly decent introduction with Donkey Kong climbing to the top of the stage. Atari Inc. released this Apple II version's 1983 port of Donkey Kong. This version doesn't look bad. Obviously, it was designed as a full screen version. It controls fairly well. Jumping is a little peculiar here. Although he jumps over obstacles just fine, it kind of looks like you're jumping and then through mid-air, it auto-jumps again. Something just wasn't right here with this. Again, Donkey Kong is situated on the right-hand side, which many versions did, but we do get fairly good scrolling action here. There doesn't appear to be any slowdowns even when playing level 2. On second inspection with this release and the DOS release, both appeared to be used in the same look for when Mario's walking, or rather doing that Mr. Bean dance. Talking about sprites, stage 2 with this Apple II version avoids having moving fire obstacles and replaces them with something I cannot work out at all. Possibly worms, I'm not sure. The opening music for levels is fairly bad here, although not as terrible as say the DOS version. The Atari 8-bit computers got a fairly good home conversion in 1983 when Atari Inc. released it. Firstly, we have some faithful sounding music, which sounds like the arcades game, complete with sound effects which also sound very good here too. It also plays, or rather controls nicely too. Donkey Kong again is placed on the opposite side of where he should actually be. I am sure at this point that coders were doing this for a reason, but I cannot think why that would have been. However, Donkey Kong is animated really nicely here, chugging down his barrels. The sound effects for smashing barrels also sounds good, as well as jumping over obstacles. One thing with this port is that, as you can see in the gameplay footage, this is a very fast version compared to everything else in this list. which if you're used to how it was originally designed, the speed of the gameplay, it can be a little bit off-putting, or it simply just takes a little time getting used to this speed. The game's layout is very similar to what it is emulating in terms of platforms. Although this is a good version, I just found it way too fast, and also had a full screen rather than centralized. The colour palette used was on the brown side too. I will say though that when Donkey Kong falls from his spot during level 2, this actually looked fairly good. Not all versions did this. 1988 saw the Atari 7800s released by Atari Corporation. Now, although the gameplay was excellent here, the sound this version makes is not excellent at all. It simply is just a racket. It's certainly a big upgrade from the Atari 2600s version. We do have music here as well as sound effects. Controls are very responsive here, meaning that there is no actual delay when pressing fire button to jump over things at split-second moments. It's a fast version to play, and I thought this was one of the tougher versions too. It's presented in a full screen, which personally I think this game does look better with that vertical centralized look. If full screen versions were condensed, I am pretty sure they would look much better too. This isn't a bad version, it's just let down by the sound if anything. A real shame. The Atari 7800 was fully capable of much better than this. I also assume that being an upgraded version from the 2600 release, this might have included Donkey Kong climbing up the construction site, but that didn't actually happen here. The TI-99 or Texas Instruments 1983 release by Atari Inc. wasn't actually that bad. We get a very basic start screen with no sound. We also get no introduction to levels either here, but this is nothing out of the ordinary for older systems, obviously that is. Making changes to preserve space was priority. What we do get though is a very good version of Donkey Kong here. It is certainly a very colourful game and responds nicely to controls too. When Mario jumps, we have enough room to actually jump over 2 barrels, so no issues with jumping height at all here. Of course, we have no music in game. Donkey Kong is not animated here either. He just stays static and does not throw any barrels. The platform colours of the construction sites are slightly different. Pauline even has the same text appearing from her mouth here saying help. I did find, however, once getting to level 2, the roaming fires actually cause a very slight slowdown whilst playing. Nothing too major though. We do get a centralised display for the game, so it looks a little more like the classic arcade game. Next up, we have the ColecoVision 1982 release. This version of Donkey Kong was actually a packing game for the system on its release. We don't get an introduction here at all, and what we got is a full screen, which, as I said before, I'm not a personal big fan of when this game is presented like this, as things can look a little stretched. This version, on the other hand, I'm willing to make those preferences disappear. What we have here is a superb version of the arcade game. Mario is nicely detailed. Although the TI-99 release had this, the ColecoVision game does it better, and we no longer have dull colours. The colours here are vibrant and very cheerful. I'm also willing to forgive the coder for once again putting Donkey Kong on the wrong side of the screen. The level of difficulty here can be changed when the game boots up. I played it on default mode and it offered a fair challenge, but gave up with level 2 here. I get frustrated with level 2 at the best of times. The Commodore 64 received 2 versions of this game. This 1983 version by AtariSoft was a very early game for the Commodore 64, which at this point was around a year old. This is a really nice version. It was difficult placing this conversion, as I personally prefer the vertical central look, and this one has a full screen of course. It is also a very blocky looking game too, but aside from that, it's extremely faithful to the arcades game. It's got in-game music as well as sound effects. The good thing here is that the music sounds very much like the arcade game. That very low-key bass line and the sound effects are fairly impressive too. This release goes for the Western arcade game where level 2 is different from the Japanese release. It's a really responsive game. I don't really have a complaint with this apart from being full screen. Although the Ocean Commodore 64 conversion is a little duller on colour usage, which is common practice for Commodore 64 games, everything else is here that the arcade game had. This released in 1986 and it follows the Japanese structure of the game where level 2 is different from the US release. As a game itself, it's a really good version of it. It's just one of a few versions which actually features the full animation of Donkey Kong climbing and jumping across the top of the platform to take his position when the game starts. You can also see that there has been attempts on the first level platforms to give it the same colour as the arcade game, where two colours have been placed beside each other to make this look right. The music is adequate here, and it's just a good job that somebody didn't go mental with the SID chip here, but the coder stuck to the original sound, and the sound effects which sound okay too. It is in the vertical centralized position, and it handles well. Mario's jump height is very good, and climbing ladders is pretty much fast enough and spot on. Yeah, it's a good version for sure. I put this one over the Atari Soft release for a centralized look. Both releases for Commodore 64 were equally as good in different ways. Throughout my 50 plus arcade ports videos, a few people have generally said I have a bias against Amstrad. I'm not going to point fingers, but here we are, Amstrad's conversion of Donkey Kong in second place. So, why is this? This Ocean 1986 release does what both Commodore 64 versions did, but much better. Controls feel much tighter here, and the colours are obviously brighter too. And of course, Donkey Kong originally, although black in backgrounds, had very standout and colourful platforms, and that's where Amstrad's colour palette comes in handy here. It also runs nice and smoothly too, which is surprising for an Amstrad CPC game that normally slugs along in comparison to other 8-bit computers of that era. I have chosen the NES and Famicom versions of Donkey Kong in first place. This comprises of the NES version released in 1986, the 1983 Famicom Japanese release, and the Famicom Disk System version which released in 1988. Although the Japanese versions include more levels, the text and graphics used are slightly different from the version released outside of Japan. They are pretty much the same game though, and in each release they are pretty much as good as each other, and certainly in my opinion the best versions of Donkey Kong's home conversions. Nintendo used Nintendo R&D1, or simply Nintendo Research and Development for these, who produce some of Nintendo's finest franchises, Metroids to name one. Generally, these releases do all play very similar to each other, if not the same, and to most people not analysing things like I have done, most will presume that they all look the same. The Famicom Disk System version of Donkey Kong does have some minor differences though, graphically speaking. For example, when Mario lands from jumping in the Famicom Disk System version, we no longer have the puff of dust when he lands, whereas the NES version copies the arcade's release. If we take a look at the heart with the Famicom Disk System release, you'll see that it actually has a white border around it, as with the original release, this isn't the case at all. We also have a change of text colour when jumping and earning points. The FDS version changed it to orange rather than the original version's white text. All in all, regardless of these very minor changes, they all play so well. They are solid conversions to the arcade game itself. Sure, they aren't in that long arcade centralized ratio look, but these really do get away with it for how amazing they control. They're nicely animated, really colourful, and their sprites are fantastically designed too, across all three different versions. The FDS and cartridge versions, minor differences is really down to preference. They are all pretty much the same game, like I've said. And that's it for ranking many of the Donkey Kong versions for home conversions today. I have likely missed out a couple, so apologies apologies if I've not included those, but as I said at the start of the video, Donkey Kong has a lifetime of different versions, clones and everything else. So hopefully I've covered all the major releases here. Which version of Donkey Kong did you play? Would you like me and experience it first on the Atari 2600? Let us know in the comments, and do you agree with Nintendo, FDS and Famicom and NES releases going in first place? Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.